Welcome to another episode of Million Dollar Stories, where we get to interview authors from all over the world. You know, I love talking to authors because they have the courage to take their thoughts, put it down on a piece of paper, and share it with the world, ultimately changing their legacy and destiny in the process. The book that we're talking about today is really all about wealth creation and understanding maybe some markets and where you can capitalize on certain things that are happening in the world. I believe that if you think like an entrepreneur, you can always win no matter what situation you're put in. And if you're out there and you're looking to write a book, check out dreamstarterspublishing.com. We can help you out with wherever you're at in the process. And if you have a book, you want to put it on autopilot, check out bookmarketingcrm.com. And once again, the book that we're discussing is really all about wealth creation in regards to silver. The title is called The Big Silver Shorts: How the Wall Street Banks Have Left the Silver Market in Place for the Short Squeeze of a Lifetime. It's an honor to have the author with us today, Chris Marcus. Thanks so much for being here, man.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate you having me on your show. Nice to talk with you, especially someone who's spent far more time than me going through the book process multiple times, but definitely interesting times in the gold and silver market, and also looking forward to digging into any advice that could be helpful for people who are going through the entrepreneurial journey, and appreciate that you're digging into these things and sharing some insight on that.
Well, in my group, the mastermind is called Million Dollar Circle. It's a free group. We just talk about wealth creation, financial freedom and entrepreneurial activity, book creation. We do talk about gold and silver quite a bit, and just assets in general, real assets. And it looks like, I mean, when we're talking about book creation, your book I think it has 326 reviews on Amazon. So it's resonating with the world, potentially because of inflation is just getting out of control. And the price of silver has gone up drastically in the past, let's just say 5 years. But precious metals, I think, will continue to grow up the more they keep printing. So, what made you want to sit down and write this book in the first place? And if you can give a quick little outline of your pathway to where you're at now, that'd be pretty helpful too.
Sure. Well, a lot of this started back when I was still on a trading floor in New York in 2007, 2008, 2009, and the housing bubble imploded. I had just come out of business school a few years earlier, and even between that and being on the trading floor, wasn't hearing people talk about any issues in the economy. And obviously, you had the Fed and the Treasury Secretary saying subprime was contained, and we all found out later on that that wasn't the case. So seeing how that really has such a drastic impact on all of the markets, and also finding it interesting how seemingly very few people had noticed that, that led me to start studying some of the guys who had forecasted in advance. All of them are talking about gold and silver and how the credit cycle of the Fed works, how you get these periods we have low interest rates and you start getting some of these bubbles when you have the higher interest rates. Usually that has the effect of bringing some of the bubbles back in check. So seeing the response back then, where we've just printed and borrowed faster than ever, really led me into the gold and silver world. And I finished a couple more years on the trading floor before I felt this was an important topic to talk about and at least let people know what I was seeing, which is often a bit different from what we hear in the mainstream media. So that was back in 2012, leaving Wall Street. And since then, I've written, started doing podcasts and about gold and silver. And then I guess it was 2019 when I started recording the interviews for the book. And the way it played out was interview format, which actually I'd seen there's a great series of books that, Mike, you may be familiar with, The Market Wizards by an author named Jack Schwager, where he would interview a bunch of really successful traders and compile those interviews into a book, which were some of my favorites. And I thought that would be a good template for what I was seeing in silver, where went out and spoke to a lot of the people that I had learned from in that decade. And we did some interviews digging into all these different things with silver, whether the US debt is ever going to get paid and how some of these things will ultimately unfold. So that led to the big silver short, which I know you say that the silver market has had quite a run in the past couple of years. It's gone up, went up in 2020, has traded in a range since then. We've gotten close to that $30 mark a couple of times. I would say what I saw back then and still expect to happen. I think there's still a large chunk of this ahead of us, even despite what we've seen in the past couple of weeks. And it sure seems when you look at some of the things that are happening out there, where now a large portion of the world is actively not just talking about de-dollarizing and making preparations so that their economies aren't dependent on this dollar system that we have, but they're not just talking about it anymore, but actually making plans and doing some of these things. And then you add on sanctions for Russia. Now we're hearing about the potential for sanctions against China, which is is really a scary trend that we're going down, but also at the same time, the the reasons that I think we're seeing gold and silver move again now, and that I think this is still in the early days. If we imagine going ahead 10 years and looking back on some of the things that are happening now, I don't think we've seen the main event just yet, and I guess we'll find out in the next coming years.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now, and it seemed like it hit about $35, I think in 2012 or somewhere in there, 2012, 2013, which dropped quite a bit, what, 2016 to 2020, and then just started spiking again. So it looks like it's on a run, so we'll see. But can you give a quick little background on why you even fell in love with silver in the first place? Maybe I mean, we've interviewed experts when it comes to even the battle between the gold standard and the silver standard when it comes to the late 1800s and why the gold standard won out. But I believe any precious metal such as gold or silver is a great investment. Maybe it doesn't spike every year, but it's always going to hold value. So, in my opinion, it's a safe bet. Maybe not going to make you extremely wealthy overnight, but very much like real estate. It's bound to go up if you hold on to it. So, what did you see or what did you learn about silver that really drew your eyes towards it?
Yeah, well, I think you summarized it pretty well there, where what drew me into this was seeing the issues with the currency printing and the debt, which probably is not rocket science to imagine that those are going to continue to get bigger. I mean, we're this late in the game, and you see there's no spending cuts. Not sure if it's even possible that if you had a balanced budget, I mean, you'd lose so much in GDP that
Yeah.
you'd have an issue there as well. So, and I think you phrased it well, that is there a scenario in which someone could become quite wealthy from gold and silver? Yeah, if you have a complete blowout or if there's a substantial reset, you could have substantially higher gold and silver prices. And I think that's something I keep in the back of my mind, although perhaps a better way of phrasing gold and silver is almost more like an insurance or protection against what you see happening. We saw that happen following the housing bubble in 2008. Both gold and silver spiked, silver back up to $50, gold getting up to 1900 back then. So had a bit of a quiet decade in between then, even though the Fed balance sheet and debt loads were getting bigger. Um, but really seeing that we were going to have a point in time where this has to be dealt with. I think we're nearing that point in time. Again, not quite there just yet. So in terms of why silver, why I focused on that more specifically than gold, again, I was an option trader as a background. So there's a degree to which we were trained that, you take the single when it's there, but there's also a time to be aggressive when you see something that's out of line, which by all means, I'm not giving financial advice of what anyone should do here, but seeing the dynamics in silver, which is a much smaller market. So you can have the silver market move with not that much money coming into it. And then something that has been exacerbated since I first got into it, but you have a lot of the silver is consumed in industrial applications. So most of the gold is still out there in bar or coin form, obviously some jewelry as well. But that always struck me with silver, where you have this supply, but a lot of it is being consumed. And if we do have a real spark in investment demand, you could very quickly have a situation where silver outperforms gold. We've seen that start to occur a little bit over these past couple of weeks, but along with that, the the supply and demand fundamentals for silver have become a lot more exacerbated. We have the Silver Institute, which compiles numbers. They've showed us now in a deficit for the last 3 or 4 years. And some of the projections that come out, there was a study by Oxford Economics where they were forecasting industrial demand for silver over the next decade. Again, take it with a grain of salt. How the world is going to change in the next decade is hardly written in stone, but they had the industrial growth doubling over the next decade. So between solar panels, EVs, electrical applications, and now you even have some of the banks coming out at an interesting report from TD Securities a couple of weeks ago, where they were even warning of the next silver squeeze. And to see that this is not just the gold and silver community that's looking at these things anymore, it's going out in a lot of the banks, the research reports they put out, getting to institutional clients. So now you have a lot of these same dynamics, but also the potential that should this continue, which at the moment it seems like it is, there is that possibility that we do get to an environment where there's a shortage of silver. Certainly not a guarantee, but if you do have something like that happen, then that's part of the additional upside that, again, I didn't forecast that back in 2009 and 2010, but certainly that's become another factor that certainly goes in silver's favor at this point.
Well, I've been paying attention to gold more than silver, and just reading up on the history of it is fascinating. But when I look at what's happening in the world with all the wars, I look at certain countries that are all of a sudden popping up in battles. And what's funny about most of these countries is that the ones who are maybe throwing some bombs at others are a part of BRICS. They're in the BRICS world, right? So they're trying to create a whole new world currency that pretty much will topple the dollar. And I look at that and I say, wow, there's some type of chess game being played. And in my opinion, maybe they're out there trying to buy up gold. Maybe they're trying to buy up more precious metals. I don't know. But when I see that, I'm like, all right, I need to protect my money as much as possible. And by doing that, it's investing in businesses that produce cash flow and invest in assets that will always hold value, like gold and silver. So, is it, when you look at this, when you see what's going on in the world, I guess, are you playing the game according to what you're seeing in the geopolitical sphere, or is it basically from interviewing people like, and I don't know who this is, but Ted Butler, experts like Ted Butler on maybe what he knows in the circles that he's in, and therefore kind of behind the curtains, of you, if you will, of the elite, very much like what Warren Buffett's doing or what JP Morgan's doing. And so maybe there's some certain things that are happening, regardless of what's happening in the world, that we need to be aware of. And so if there's anything I could summarize up in this word salad, is that, I'm looking at your statement here, why Ted Butler thinks JP Morgan has more than 800 million ounces of silver. I think that kind of is very interesting to read and say, why the hell are they doing this? And maybe they know something about US or the world that we don't. So anything you can share in regards to that?
Yeah, well, that's remained a little bit of a mystery. I've heard people speculate that it's being held on behalf of the US government. Obviously, JP Morgan is the custodian for the SLV fund, so they have silver that they're storing for that. And uh, along those lines, we've also had JP Morgan get fined by the government. I believe it was $920 million a couple of years ago for their involvement in the gold and silver market. So
Which is
obviously,
nothing to them. Am I right? Which is a parking ticket, right?
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean that's close to $1 billion, so that was a little bit of a dent, but again, relative to some of the income that they have, not sure how much of an impact it's made, but yeah, I guess it's a balance of looking at what's happening with silver and the supply and demand, yet also factoring in what you said about the things that are happening in the world and the move by Russia after they went into Ukraine, where they had a temporary gold backing to the dollar. Putin's been talking about gold. One of the foreign finance ministers, Sergei Glaziev, has been giving interviews, writing papers, talking about how they see gold playing a role as a settlement mechanism amongst the BRICS countries. So
Yes.
interesting how 10 or 20 years ago you would hear people talk about the reasons why certain countries weren't in the best position, being reliant upon the dollar. Yet now you're actually seeing them talk about it openly. It's not just speculation. And obviously China has been consuming massive amounts of gold, and a big driver, I think, behind what we're seeing right now. So yeah, it's a combination of the particulars on gold and silver, but what drives that is often what's happening on the governmental or central bank level. So I guess you're balancing all of those things and trying to read the tea leaves. Again, it's you don't always get the clearest information. We don't know exactly how much gold China brings in. They don't go out of their way to publicize the exact figures in there. And certain people think that they have multiples more. And I would agree with that than what they report. So yeah, you're trying to balance the things that are going on with the individual market plus these trends that are happening in the world, which as we go and progress each day, you see more and more a move towards gold, which makes sense at the same time because we're in a financial system that's based on the US Treasury as a store of value. And now we have higher interest rates, which has clobbered a lot of the Treasury investments. Then you saw that last year when a couple of the commercial banks here in the US failed. Add to that that I think the US is set to roll over about $9 trillion of US Treasury debt this year. A lot of this is short term borrowing, and you add on the deficits that are coming out to that, and it starts to become a little harder to see how all of this gets funded unless the Federal Reserve steps back in. So a lot of moving pieces, but looking at those things and trying to extrapolate what's going to happen and why I think that even despite the move that we've seen so far, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see things consolidate. I don't know that I see a scenario in which we could have a reset or a sharp move up, but also there's a very perhaps a larger probability that we continue to trend higher like we have been. So um, the timeline remains the uncertain part, but certainly it seems like a lot of the things that the silver bugs from back in the 80s and 90s were talking about, where, back then we're like, well, one day this or that might happen. And now a lot of these things sure feel like they're coming to a head now.
Well, whenever I read in your summary about the truth about Warren Buffett's silver position, how he got forced, let me pull this up, why he got forced out of it, made me think of whenever I was back in college. I graduated from Duquesne University in 2007, and pretty much I was a finance major for the last 2 years of my college. What they did was basically said, all right, in order to become successful, just do whatever Warren Buffett does, and then watch Mad Money with Jim Cramer. Those are the two things that were constantly talked about in college. It's just mind boggling. And now that I know that Jim Cramer most likely is completely full of shit on pretty much everything he's bought and paid for, I don't trust anything that college has really taught me. So when I look at it, Warren Buffett, now he invested in Coca-Cola, the wood, shipping companies, lumber yards, and all that. I'm still fascinated with how he invests, but we never talked about his silver position and what he thought about precious metals. So can you enlighten us with this insight? Because I don't know anything about this.
Well, he actually gave a speech, I believe it was their shareholder conference, I think in 1990, where he talked about silver and the growing industrial applications and how he was looking at making an investment in silver, which he did a couple of years later. But what stood out to me is that basically, if you go back and watch that, and it's on YouTube, I think we actually still have a clip of that up on our channel. All the factors that he cited are still in play now, perhaps more exacerbated now than back then. I guess the one thing that he differs on, he is not a big fan of sound money, as I'm sure many people are well aware, which on one hand I get, where if you're looking at, like you mentioned, an income producing asset or something that is creating cash flow versus gold or silver, which do not. but I don't know if that's maybe the best comparison. I mean, they serve different purposes.
Stored
And
value, yeah, there's difference, right? There's one's slow money, one's short, fast money in the way I look at it. So you need them both.
yeah, and ironically, his father, Howard Buffett, was almost like the Ron Paul of his day, as he was well known to be a sound money advocate, was talking about gold quite a bit. And something that I think people are often unaware is that both gold and silver have actually outperformed S&P, NASDAQ, and Dow Jones since the turn of the century. Obviously, you can pick other data points where that's not the case, but I think in the environment we have, and when you look at what is the purpose of gold and silver to provide a store of value, I don't I wouldn't compare gold and silver against a business. They're different purposes, but when you look at the actual purpose that at least that I look to gold and silver for, and I think most people who get invested in gold and silver, you're looking at that store of value and having a way to keep the value of your money. By all means, investing in a productive business along with that, I think can be a great thing. And I don't maybe I'm a little bit guilty of this, and certainly people in the gold and silver crowd, some people go all in and don't think it necessarily needs to be a means of that. There's a balance for everything, but so Buffett was not big on the monetary investing in gold and silver, but he did have a large silver investment, which, at least as the story goes, he got himself into trouble and was essentially nudged by the government to let go of his silver, which then became the silver that was used to seed the SLV fund, which I believe was 2005 or 2006. So not he's not a big fan of gold, but has invested in silver two separate times, and be curious to hear his thoughts on silver now, especially as some of the conditions that he talked about in that 1990 meeting again are very much present and perhaps even more extreme now than they were back then.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I want to look into some of the history of silver now that it's popping up more and more on my radar. But it's kind of interesting to look back on the history of gold when it comes to certain presidents made it illegal to even own gold, right? Are you familiar with that executive order? It was passed, I think, in the 30s or 40s,
Yeah,
but
back in 1933.
1933, it was illegal to own gold, and I don't know how long that lasted, but I think it was an extended amount of time. Am I right?
Yeah, until 1974, we were taken off the gold standard in 1971 by Nixon, although I think it was not until 1974 where they actually changed the eligibility for people to actually physically own gold again. I hear a lot of people did not actually turn their gold in back in the
Of course,
1930s.
yeah.
So,
Why would you? Who
um,
would, by the way, if you think about it, who would do that, right? Like, it doesn't make sense to me if I even heard that, but wait a second. The government wants my money that I know is going to be valuable for generations. That sounds a little fishy, in my opinion.
and then, of course, the year after they confiscated the gold at $21, then the Federal Reserve raised the price to $35. So was wasn't the best deal for the people that did turn in their gold. And something that people wonder about, I tend to think that would be hard to pull off, especially in today's culture where it feels like trust of government is a lot lower than I imagine it was back in the
Oh,
1930s.
no
So,
doubt. No
especially
doubt.
with people in many cases, think of how to phrase this appropriately, but a lot of gold and silver owners, also gun owners. So I don't know how that would play out if the government came out today in the situation that we've been left in, where people are buying gold and silver specifically because of what's happened with the government finances. I don't think that they're going to attempt something like that again. But yeah, that definitely did happen back in the 1930s, and quite an interesting history of gold and silver, where in 1792 we had the gold and silver standard, which, due to the ratio being slightly off, most of the gold was hoarded and we were on a silver standard. They changed the
Yes.
ratio in 1833 a little bit to the other direction, and people started hoarding the silver and using the gold as the currency. And then in 1873, we had what is known as the crime of 1873, where silver was demonetized after that and has had less of a formal role. We did have it in the coinage in the 1900s, but quite an interesting history where it's gone back and forth. And ironically, one other thing that came out recently is earlier this year, the Philadelphia Federal Reserve actually did a study on whether gold stabilizes prices in the long term. Shockingly, they found out, according to their research, that it does. So, just interesting to see that even the Federal Reserve would be studying a gold standard, which past couple Federal Reserve chairmen, Bernanke, Jerome Powell, have talked about. Anytime someone asked them about gold, they act like they couldn't have less interest. Yet, I think that's interesting time for them to actually publish a study. Which, to be clear, I'm not saying that means they're putting us back on a gold standard, but I think that's somewhat significant that they are doing that research and thinking about it.
Now you mentioned that silver, this is just the beginning, right? And I think because they printed, I believe you might know this, but when it comes to the entire money supply of the United States dollar, I think they printed, I was it 60 or 70% in the past 4 years or 5 years, something like that. It's really absurd. So maybe we're at the very beginning of a rise in this. So obviously you're not giving financial advice, but what does your strategy for you look like? Are you still a trader? Are you still actively earning your money a certain way? And then you just use silver as a stored value? Or are you also in the real estate world? Are you also in maybe e-com, or you doing other things? And so it's maybe just part of your portfolio. And if so, what percentage would you say that focus on precious metals?
Well, I'm probably a little bit heavier on the precious metals percentage than I would certainly advocate to most people. With that said, as you mentioned there, something that I've been doing through the channel, though, especially in the past couple of months, have been looking in some different ways to expand in terms of not just having metals, but also expanding creative income generation through businesses, a couple things online. And I think that's an important part of it. I think there's going to be a good future for gold and silver. Certainly, the idea of having diversification in the things that you're doing is a wise play. Obviously, with the stock market pretty elevated and soaring by the day, often it feels like I do worry about the possibility of a pullback there. Yet, going back to what you said, it's really something I've been thinking about lately, where for a decade or so was primarily focused on silver, but I think that having balance to that, where you have whatever form that ends up for someone, income creating businesses and using some of that capital for that purpose, I think makes a lot of sense and is something that been studying. I spent half the day studying silver in the markets and then doing a lot of marketing and have a couple of projects I'm working on so that you have a balance to these things. And certainly with gold and silver, which is less of a short-term market where certainly there is trading opportunities within gold and silver. At this point, more so, I look at gold and silver as an insurance that I'm leaving there and comfortable with. So getting a mix of the two, I think, is something that makes a lot of sense in what I've been focusing on these days.
So whenever I'm at my dad's house, he'll be watching TV and there'll be advertisements for gold or silver, and he always asks me, "Hey, what do you think of that? Is that a good place to buy it from, or what would you buy that?" And I would say certain aspects about what I would do with $1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 is do this with it instead. You'd get a better return. It's an asset, but those gold and silver commercials always kind of give me a little bit of I don't know, the girls call it the ick, right? You're sort of like, is that a trustworthy company? So I really don't know who to go to buy gold and silver when it comes to a website or a company. Is there any that you religiously go to, or some website or part of your habit schedule that you look at and you trust certain companies to buy from? So I think that's probably the best question to ask is if somebody's listening to this right now and they want to get into this, where do they go and how do they get involved?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there are a few dealers out there that have gotten themselves into trouble and have done some things that are less than ideal. Fortunately, there are a lot of good dealers out there as well that I've purchased from. We have a partnership with Miles Franklin, which is a gold and silver dealer, so that obviously we're talking about silver a lot in our show in the book. So we wanted to have a place where people could get good pricing and also a place that has a good reputation. They've been in business for 35 years and people know that they're getting the actual gold and silver they pay for, without having to wonder whether it's going to show up or whether place is in business the next month. So Miles Franklin is the one that I have a partnership with. With that said, there's a bunch of dealers that are good online. SD Bullion is a place that I purchase metals from. They have good pricing. You get things safely. JM Bullion. Um, so there's a handful of them out there. I think a big part of it is one of the things I like about Miles Franklin is it's not just online, but you can actually talk to someone. So if you have questions about the markets or what's happening or want to check in with something that happens with your order, I think that's a nice feature to have where you have someone rather than just the customer service number. Some people don't need that, so some of the other online dealers are good, but I think just asking around, looking at the track record, talking with people who have purchased from certain places. One thing I would be careful of is, and I've heard people having trouble, is some of the groups that pop up on Facebook where saying, "Oh, get your special coin here." They send money and then the place disappears. So definitely making sure they have a track record. And if you can't find the track record, at the very least, calling up and talking to people there, seeing if you feel comfortable and if it seems like a legitimate operation, because there are some out there that unfortunately have done some things that are not quite above board. And maybe one other thing to watch out for is that there are some places that try to get people into numismatics. And that's basically when you're looking at a collectible or a rare coin that has a really high premium, which in one sense, there are numismatics that can be a good investment, but you're getting a bit farther away from at least what we've been talking about here today in terms of gold and silver as a hedge against some of the issues that are happening in the markets. Um, you, I wouldn't want to be going out and paying a 40% premium on a gold coin. Now, if you love collecting coins and reading about rare coins and you're knowledgeable about that, then by all means, that's fine. Just when people are advertising gold and silver as a hedge against inflation, I would be careful if someone's then directing you into numismatics, which is one of the things that a couple brokerages have gotten in trouble with. So just something to be careful with there.
So who do you look up to when it comes to advice? I see Peter Schiff talk a lot about gold. I see Robert Kiyosaki, the guy that I believe changed my life more than anybody else whenever he wrote Rich Dad Poor Dad. So I look at certain people for advice. Who do you look up to? Or is there a book out there that you recommend to our audience?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Robert Kiyosaki. I actually did do an interview with him about 5 or 6 years ago, and where we talked about gold. And obviously, he is quite a big fan of gold and silver, as well as other things. Um, but in the gold and silver community, there's a lot of really great teachers out there. Eric Sprott was one that I learned a lot from in my early days. Craig Hemke at TF Metals is another person who provides great information on the gold and silver markets. And fortunately, we have a lot of different experts come on the show and talking about this gold and silver markets regularly. So I think it's something where it's good to hear a lot of different opinions and you can get a lot of different information out there. Combining that also with what makes sense to you. I mean, it's a pretty wide topic, gold and silver, because it's not just the metals, but so many other factors that are influencing the economies. So I don't know that there's one set expert that has all of the knowledge, but fortunately, something that's a little different now than when I started. There are a lot of good channels on YouTube that have information, and um, so there's good people out there, and those are at least a couple that I would direct people to get some more information.
Arcadia Economics, the YouTube channel. Can I find that interview with Robert Kiyosaki on there?
That was actually for a different channel a couple of years back, but I can send that one to you, and
I'd
you
love
might
to see
be
it. Yeah, I just
interested.
want to.
Yeah.
I mean, what we always ask people, like, is there a book that stands out in your life that maybe got you to fall in love with this path that you're on? And I mean, the book that really put me on this path is Rich Dad Poor Dad. When I read, I was 22, 23 years old. I got into real estate right out of the gate. And I look at Robert Kiyosaki. I'd love to interview him on my show sometime soon, and Sharon Lechter, who's also a part of that book. And so when I see what he's posting now, obviously he's very angry with the direction of the country, and so taking control of your finances is definitely the top of mind. And when you see him post, he doesn't back down from his true beliefs, which I like. So it's fascinating to see his evolution, though. Really doesn't talk about real estate anymore. It talks about gold and silver more than anything else.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the YouTube channel, though, I just want to bring this up. Arcadia Economics. What will we find on there? And is there a website? Because I don't see it listed on our notes here. Is there a website for people to get in touch with you, or any other way to maybe work with you, or get you on their show, maybe?
Yeah, well, you can find our website at arcadieconomics.com. So if anyone would like to get in touch or has questions about what's going on in gold and silver, you can contact us through there, and we'll be happy to get back and help you in any way that we can. On the YouTube channel, we have daily coverage of things that are going on in gold and silver, and obviously a lot to keep track of. But each morning we have a 9 o'clock show that gives a nice, concise overview of the key things that are happening, and wanted to make something so if people only had 10 or 15 minutes a day to keep track of what was going on, that they'd have a good overview. And then we have some other interviews throughout the week that cover, we bring some silver miners on, different fund managers on, people who look at the mining stocks in addition to the bullion. So I like to think it's a good source of information if you're interested in gold and silver, or which doesn't even have to be a matter of I want to go out and buy gold and silver, but if you just want to understand why a lot of people are looking at it and feel it's important, like to think we've created a good home where people can come and get that information, and also have it provided in a way they can actually understand and digest.
Nice. Last question I have for you. It could be short, could be long answer. That's up to you. But prediction for the future when it comes to the dollar and crypto. What's your thoughts?
Well, I think that we're going to see a decline in the dollar in the coming years. Obviously, it's been so far 2024 has been quite a strong year for the dollar. Um, but especially as you continue to have some of these trends with the de-dollarization continuing on, I think that's going to have its impact. Maybe one area where I see a little differently now than perhaps where I got started is just how intertwined the dollar is into the current system we have. So I don't know if it's going to be we're just going to wake up one morning and the dollar is going to stop being used entirely. Yet when you look at some of the things that are happening, especially with the debt market and how I would imagine a lot of that issuance is going to have to be funded, yeah, I do think we're going to see that impact the dollar in the coming years quite a bit, and be reflected in a rise in the gold and silver prices. And I don't dig into Bitcoin as much. Certainly, I think it's interesting to see how you have something where there's a finite supply and a lot of people turning to Bitcoin, similar mindset of gold and silver. I wonder what the adoption and usage of Bitcoin is eventually going to evolve into, as I don't get the feeling that it's gone on the same trajectory. I was actually reading an interesting article last week about how the direction of Bitcoin changed a bit around 2016 and 2017. So um, certainly it's been quite stunning to see the rise that we've had there. I see that possible that it could continue to be the case. And I think there's a lot of people who are looking to Bitcoin as a store of their value. And also, I just keep an eye on how the adoption goes and whether that ends up being something that will be actually used as a currency or more of a store of value, but just something to keep in mind as people are looking at it and seeing what they come up with.
The more and more I look at money, I realize that it's completely fake if they can just print it at any moment for any reason. So I look at money as fake, right? Now, it's the only reason why it holds value, in my opinion, is because enough people believe in it. And crypto, I'm not against it at all. I think it possibly is part of the future. But once again, the only reason why people believe in it is because enough people believe in it, right? But there is one thing that is undeniable. And when you look at precious metals like gold and silver, it's real, it's rare, and so it's undeniable that it holds value if it's rare and real. So, and if other people want it across the world, you can always use it as trade. So that's why I look at this and say it's a smart investment. And once again, I'm not giving financial advice, but I think that silver and gold always going to be a part of our future. Crypto, we'll see where it goes. I mean, I'm going to still dabble in it, but oh my God, the dollar. Create assets or buy assets that produce cash flow, take the cash flow and have that cash flow either buy your liabilities or buy more assets, plain and simple. So I'm with you on a lot, man. And I can't thank you enough for coming on the show, talking a little bit about financial freedom. And once again, guys, the book is called The Big Silver Short. And it's how the Wall Street banks have left the silver market in place for the short squeeze of a lifetime. So check his website out and look for him on YouTube, Arcadia Economics is the YouTube channel. So, Chris, Marcus, thanks so much, man.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. And thanks for having me on.
Remember, guys, $1 million book will lead to $1 million life. Right on.